Thank you everybody for joining our space forum this evening, Space Stations in Popular Culture. I think you're really going to enjoy it. And I also want to say on behalf of Larry Ahern, we're glad to have you for this very first Space Forum of 2021. I was talking to someone today earlier and I said, how long is it acceptable to say Happy New Year? So what I figure I'll say is happy belated New Year greetings to everybody. We're hoping you're off to a good start to the new year. And we're looking forward to an exciting year of space forums and town halls. We're starting to work on our schedule. We hope to be able to publish something more long-term to give you an idea of what's coming up next. And we also hope to experiment with some different days and times because we know that is an issue with everybody. What I want to do now is just talk a little bit about our etiquette. You're probably familiar with this already. To submit a question, I'll ask you to use the Q&A function, and only the panelists can see that. So it works a little better. It's easier for us to grab the questions that come in. On the chat, it's everything. You got comments and things like that, and people saying hello. So it's a little harder to find the questions and funnel them to our speaker. So please try to use the Q&A function for your questions and use the chat for other things. But I ask you to be respectful of both the panelists and the audience because, again, everybody can see it. Our agenda, I'll do an introduction and we'll turn right over to our speaker. We'll be talking for about 45 to 50 minutes. Then we'll go into Q&A. I do have some questions that were submitted prior, and we'll try to get as many questions answered as we can. We'll close out with some upcoming space forums, and then I always close with a final NSS announcement. So we hope for a really fun evening this evening. So our speaker tonight is Bill Bradshaw, and Bill is an NSS member. A while back, he contacted me. He had been a participant in a number of our space forums over the course of last year, and he told me about this great presentation that he had related to space stations. And I said, hey, that sounds like something that our members would be interested in. Bill is originally from Florida. He has spent his whole career in the science museum industry, I guess I'll call it. And he's been a space advocate, a space follower since he was young. He actually witnessed the Apollo 11 launch with a media pass, which is pretty impressive. I'm jealous already, Bill. But he has a great collection of science and cultural things because he was in those museum business. So I think he's going to have a very unique perspective tonight when he's talking about the space stations and popular culture. So I don't want to take any more time. I want to turn it over to Bill, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can see Bill and hear Bill. Bill, it's all yours.
Okay. Let me get my program up. There we go. Can you see that, Bert?
Not yet.
Okay.
We'll let you know.
Let's go back a step.
There's always fun with technology.
All right.
Just hit the, you go share screen.
There we go.
Yep, you got it? Oh, there you go. You got it, Bill. Okay, I'm going to leave it to you now, Bill.
All right. So what we're going to be talking about...
I want to put it into slide mode if you can.
Talking about this evening is space stations and the dreams of space stations over the past 100 years or so. And I hope along the way we can answer some questions about space stations. I like this quote from Willy Ley, ideas like large rivers never have just one source. I used two books as the primary starting point for my presentation. One is Space Stations. The one on the left is very graphic. The one on the right has more thoughtful content. They're both very, very useful in terms of identifying where I should go to collect the additional graphic information that I wanted to include. And then these two books, of course, are natural resources for filling out a program of this nature. But along the way, you will see some images with a book in the right or left-hand corner. These are books that I have in my collection, and I just show you the book so that you can know where that particular graphic came from. Many of the graphic items came just off the Google image search, so I could not identify where they were. Along the way tonight, we're going to explore these questions. Why have a space station? Who developed the concept of space station? How can they be used? And how can they be powered? So let's begin with the first time a space station was in literature. This is 1869. Edward Everett Hale published this story in Atlantic Monthly. And it was about a space station that was made of bricks. Now, not necessarily very practical, but still it did allow him to explore some of the aspects of space stations. It was 200 feet in diameter. It was launched into orbit by two giant flywheels powered by water. And once in orbit, it provided a habitat for humans who accidentally had been transported to orbit because the full thing shot off the night before it was supposed to while it had people on board. So they found that they could communicate with Earth, a communication satellite, by putting sheets on the outside of the space station. They used it for navigation. That's why it was originally going to be sent into orbit, so it provide a constant star for Earth navigators. But it also was projected to do mapping and surveying, observing weather phenomena, and military reconnaissance. So here are some of the reasons why space stations were even considered in literature and in science. Then in 1897, a book by the name of a title of On Two Planets had a group of balloon enthusiasts trying to reach the North Pole, but they were diverted by a space station above the North Pole, which turned out to be of Martian origin, and they were transported to Mars. This particular book was read as a child by Wernher von Braun, and he remembered it very fondly as one of the examples of science fiction literature that inspired the Rocketeers to follow. Now we come to a theoretical thinker, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the Russian. He did not do very much experimental work, but he thought and conceived so many things that relate to rocketry and, in our particular case, space stations. So he wrote a book called Dreams of Earth and Sky in 1895 that described humanity's settlement of space, including mining asteroids and orbiting greenhouses. And here is a sketch of his space station. He called it a space cottage. This is 1903. Notice on the right illustration, you can see it has an airlock for allowing astronauts to come and go, gyroscopes for stability, and a reaction motor so that it could be moved around in orbit. It was for research, provided living quarters, and rocket launching. Some additional sketches from his workbooks. Weightlessness depicted in his illustrations, and the first perhaps thought of tourism in space, with people enjoying some look like might be volleyball in weightless conditions and looking out some windows at Earth or at the solar phenomena. He also had an airlock built in, which allowed his astronauts, cosmonauts as we call them now, to come and go for EVA purposes. Oxygen and food were provided by living plants in a later version of this, which was used to provide a closed cycle system. Here's something that I found in one of his books. You might think, well, did he have artificial gravity? That seems like a pretty modern idea. And he did. And the way he puzzled through this was by thinking of a container full of water being spun and seeing how that water is distributed along the sides of the container. Or, as you can see on the right side, a ball on a string with that being twirled, producing centripetal force, which produced that artificial gravity. He provided a spin to provide artificial gravity. He let the sun do a lot of work for him by keeping the plants alive. And he created on paper a complete biosphere. Conceptually, crew of 50 with family members and a garden to sustain them. He even thought of it being economically self-sufficient by harvesting asteroids, using the material for the asteroids to build products useful on planet Earth and selling those products to planet Earth. Russian art, Russian scientists, Russian thinkers have continued in his mold and certainly have provided a lot of concepts for space stations prior to the real things that they created. Now let's go to perhaps the most unusual of all of the people that I uncovered, an Austro-Hungarian Hermann Nordung, 1929. This man was in the military. He was an artillerist. He did study astrophysics, but he created a space station in the most detailed form to date, and in fact, so detailed that it dominated the thinking of space stations for decades to follow. It was serialized in 3 parts in the Science Wonder Story magazine, with the art being provided by Frank R. Paul. Let's take a closer look at this. The Rotary House is the primary center of the space station, the observatory, and then the engine house. We'll take a look at each of those separately, but within the overall concept, he had water and air being recycled. He had a mess hall, kitchen, bathroom, workshop, dark rooms, labs. So this was a pretty complete concept for a space station. The Rotary House itself, where the astronauts would live, was 2 concave mirrors that would focus light onto pipes, steam pipes, that contained a fluid, which would be turned to steam, which would then turn turbines, which would then produce electricity for the space station. This gives you a better idea of where the crew quarters were, and the solar mirror, there are 2, one large and one smaller. This is a cutaway on the left of the station, and you can see that he had centripetal force being used to provide artificial gravity. And you can see at the bottom and top of this where the crew was on the outer circle of this structure with artificial gravity because it was being spun. They had an elevator and they had steps. And here are the steps where you could start at the center where gravity would be neutral and work your way out to the rim or come back the other way with those steps. The engine house had vaporizer tubes in the center of a large concave mirror, which focused sunlight on them, which then again produced steam, which would then be used to produce electricity in support of the observatory. And the condenser pipes would condense the liquid, the steam back to liquid, and the process would be continuous. The observatory was a place not only for observing with telescopes, Earth and space, but also control for a space mirror and a weightless lab where experiments using the weightless conditions of the lab to study chemistry and materials. So here's a man who really had very limited education, presenting the most elaborate concept of a space station. And it's almost like he was sent to Earth to do this. He died within months after publishing his space station. Science, Earth and Astro observations. He proposed military reconnaissance and even some weapons applications. Commercial applications would be communications, iceberg detection and removal by using a large reflective mirror, and exploratory, an outpost on the space frontier. And as I said, he shaped space station design for decades after. And you'll see him influencing various proposals. But here is 1930, Otto Willy Gale, The Stone from the Moon. And the artwork is by Frank Paul again. And it was published in the United States in Science Wonder Stories in 1930. And this author published several science fiction books. And what he proposed was that there would be a Koff spaceship company, which would launch frequently from the ocean. Never did quite explain that well. And they would build the Astropol space station, built over an 8-month period by 30 men. It would have 8 cargo ships operating weekly to take sodium in sheets to the space station where they would assemble it. It would orbit 95,000 miles above Earth. And this is what it looked like. Really cool looking space station. On the left, you have the work and lab areas, and on the right, the living quarters. The entire assembly spun so that artificial gravity was being provided for the people, both in the living quarters and in the work lab. In the book, one of the principals is asked, well, how are you paying for all this? And his reply is, thus far, the rockets have simply swallowed up money, unthinkable sums. It can't go on this way forever. It might sound familiar. To produce revenue, the author proposed the following. A mirror 2,000 meters in diameter would be constructed and sell sunlight to the northern reaches of the Soviet Union and of North America, areas where harbors might be iced in during the winter, or where crops might be grown in the winter with additional lighting. In addition, they would sell Earth and astronomical observations, having a large telescope on board. And they would sell rocket fuel derived from lunar water ice, hydrogen and oxygen. Now, what I find interesting about this particular story is just that. He raised the question and then provided some answers as to how a space-based economy might evolve from a space station. We have Hermann Oberth, the father, many people say, of the space programs of today. He proposed a space mirror which would be used very much like the previous one, and a space station, very elaborate space station, 2.5 miles in diameter. It included labs, crew quarters, and two very large telescopes. This is probably the most unusual looking of the space stations that we'll see today, and it's called the Springboard Space Station. Flash Gordon, the three serials that came in the latter 1930s, this one 1936, featured a space station. Sky City, the Hawkmen were the owners and operators of Sky City. Unfortunately for them, they captured Flash and put him to work in the boiler room, which somehow kept Sky City elevated into space. But he led a revolt and Sky City had its problems. But even in Flash Gordon's era of 1936, a space station or a space city was possible in our imagination. The British Interplanetary Society, R.A. Smith, proposed a space station which was a modification of Nordung's station, but perhaps more detailed. It too rotated. It had crew quarters, a solar reflector, a boiler for steam generation of electricity. And here's a very nice cutaway that I found in the Young Traveler in Space publication. If you look closely, you can see how the floors of the station were oriented so that as it spun, it would produce centripetal artificial gravity. Even included how they would come and go through an airlock. And look at all of the content that they conceived to include: cabins, physics labs, turbines, machine shop, goes on and on. So this was a very elaborate and complete concept, but still based pretty much on Norduck's concept of a space station. Some wonderful illustrations of it under construction. So in 1949, George Gallup asked the public in a poll, do you believe it possible that men in rockets will be able to reach the moon in the next 50 years? In 1949, 15% of those polled thought it was plausible. Let's see what happened in the intervening years and see what that number became in 1955. First of all, in the early 50s, there was a spate of very colorful, youth-oriented, but still very scientific, factual books that were published. This being By Spaceship to the Moon, featuring the work of Jack Coggins and Fletcher Pratt. Beautiful illustrations. And on the way to the moon, we discover that we, in fact, had built a space station as a stopping off point. You know, a lot of thought had gone into space stations for many purposes that we've seen so far, but one that I haven't mentioned was just the challenge of getting out of the Earth's gravity well. And it was assumed that no single rocket could accomplish that without refueling along the way. So space station was thought in this particular case as an opportunity to refuel our rocket and go on into lunar orbit. This particular space station was cylindrical in shape, so we have a fairly substantial break in the pattern of design. And it's one in which we'll see take more and more dominance of thinking as time goes. So cylinders became sort of a tree on the branch of space stations that were explored in different stories and by artists. But in reality, in real science, Kraft Ericke of Convair General Dynamics proposed MMS, minimum manned satellites. They were supposed to be small single purpose space stations, which were designed to perhaps observe the weather or for military reconnaissance. In the end, they weren't pursued because of the development of electronics that allowed for the satellites to be roboticized and also to send data by way of communications links. But this is what he proposed. He proposed using Convair's Atlas ICBM as a space station, with the payload being in the front, being the station, and then the fuel tank would be evacuated and be used for part of the station as well. Had an airlock, control room, laboratory, and Hawk Model Company produced a really nice manned orbiting lab based on all of the designs as a plastic model. He also proposed a manned orbiting lab of this design. If you're into space modeling, this is the most elaborate of all of the space models perhaps ever sold. It was produced by Revell and was, as you see it, not only the cylinder, but also the auxiliary rockets. Really quite a model to have. Not in production and very pricey if you can find one on eBay. Currently available, if you look hard enough, is the Pilgrim Observer Space Station, which is a very nicely conceived and beautifully designed model. If you're into this, a book, Creating Space, the story of space age told through models, is one to consider purchasing. I get a lot of my books on Abe Books. If you're not familiar with Abe Books, it's a place to get very good prices for used and old books. Okay, continuing our story, in 1951, the Hayden Planetarium had a symposium on space, and it was coordinated by Willy Ley. 200 attended, and it led to a series of magazine articles in Collier's magazine between 1952 and 1954. During that time, Collier's had about a 3 million home circulation, and they estimate that 12 to 15 million readers were exposed to that. This was an opportunity for von Braun and Willy Ley and several other of the rocket scientists to work with artists like you would not believe, and produce images which I'll show you here are just fantastic examples of what they were conceiving in their heads. This is an early version of von Braun's wheeled space station. And this is Chesley Bonstell's artwork from that Collier's magazine of the space station in orbit. Notice that it used a trough of reflective material with a pipe that would be heated by the sun to produce steam, to produce the electricity for the station. And then these beautiful cutaways done by another artist on the project of the space station. Now, it just so happened during that same period of time, Walt Disney had dreamed up this idea of a very wholesome family concept of a Disneyland, an amusement park where the family could go together. And in the early 50s, he was conceiving this, but also trying to fund it. So he and his brother, Roy Disney, came up with the idea of selling to one of the major networks, turned out to be ABC, Walt Disney's Disneyland, which featured Tomorrowland, Adventureland, and so forth, the four kingdoms of the Disney story. When they set out to do the series on television, they found that they didn't have anything in the can from old movies that they had produced and in the theme of Tomorrowland. So Walt committed the company to producing a 3-part series about man in space, and let him introduce it to you.
Here to introduce you to this new series is Walt Disney. In our modern world, everywhere we look, we see the influence science has upon our daily lives. Discoveries that were miracles a few short years ago are accepted as commonplace today. Many of the things that seem impossible now will become realities tomorrow. One of man's oldest dreams has been the desire for space travel, to travel to other worlds. Until recently, this seemed to be an impossibility. But great new discoveries have brought us to the threshold of a new frontier, the frontier of interplanetary space. In this Tomorrowland series, we are combining the tools of our trade with the knowledge of the scientists to give a factual picture of the latest plans for man's newest adventure. Here's Director Ward Kimball to tell you about it.
In working with engineers and scientists, we have found that there are many different opinions as to how we will eventually cross the space frontier. However, there's one point all of them seem to agree upon, and that is whether we use chemical fuel.
These are the principles of that story. Ward Kimball, the director, Heinz Haber, Werner von Braun, and Willy Ley. And the series included Man in Space, Man on the Moon, and Mars and Beyond. Ward Kimball being the director. By the way, it's been said that Walt Disney was so committed to this that he actually told Ward Kimball that he had a blank check to do the series, which apparently was unheard of in the Disney operation. They produced the 3 programs, 3 comic books, elaborated on it, and several other publications. Werner von Braun, by this time, had become a fairly well-known public spokesperson for space exploration. You know, remember, he came to the States after World War II and was at Fort Bliss out in Texas from 1945 to 1950, almost invisible. But with the Collier series, he was able to start positioning himself in the public mind. And with this TV series, he really took to a public position. And here, let him explain his concept of a space station.
Space in the orbit, 1,000 miles above the Earth. This advanced base, or space station, will be headquarters for the final ascent to the moon. Our space satellite will have the shape of a wheel, measuring 200 feet across. Its outside rim will contain living and working quarters for a crew of 50 men. Just below the radio and radar antenna is the atomic reactor. Its heat will be used to drive a turbo generator, which supplies the station with electricity. Access to the station will be through an airlock in the hub. The 3 large spokes are elevator shafts, and the small pipes are used as condensers for the turbo generator and the air conditioning plant. The entire wheel will slowly rotate at 3 revolutions per minute. The resulting centrifugal force will produce an artificial gravity for the men in the rim. Notice that the floors are placed so that the men stand with their heads toward the hub. The wheel is divided into 9 sections. The first section is headquarters and communications. The next section will be for Earth weather observation and prediction. Military reconnaissance experts aided by powerful optical and radar telescopes, will observe every point on the globe as the space station makes its complete trip around the Earth every 2 hours. Next is the emergency hospital section, and then the astronomy division, where men will keep an eye on the rocket ship as it makes its trip around the moon. The rest of the space station will house calculating machines, maintenance facilities, air conditioning equipment, living quarters, and even a botanical and zoological laboratory. This entire space station will have to be prefabricated and tested on the ground. After dismantling, it will be transported in pieces up to the orbit. For the difficult job of reassembling the structure, we have provided a new type of spacesuit. Using gyros and 2 small rocket motors, the operator can tilt and move in any direction. Located outside will be 7 remotely controlled mechanical arms, each a specialized tool. By rotating himself within a spacesuit, the operator can use any of the arms for the variety of tasks in assembling the space station. When the day arrives for construction to begin, the thousands of parts for the space station will be transported to the orbit by our multi-stage rockets. We merely replace the winged passenger section with a simple cargo-carrying nose. These cargo ships will be unmanned. A passenger rocket.
I find it very interesting that his pointer is a slide rule. Just think of the audacity of proposing what they were talking about without the technology of today to try and accomplish it. What's not clear in his presentation is that the space station was going to be fabricated by inflatable parts. And you can see it here from the comic book and from some illustrations from the film. And it went up and then was inflated, and then a metal surface was placed on the rubberized material that was inflated. The concept of the bottle suits, I think, is especially intriguing. Of course, not to be accomplished. So on March 9th, 1955, an estimated audience of 42 million Americans watched this program. That was about 1/3 of the US population. I was one of those 42 million, and I'm sure that this is where my interest in the space program began. And many of you probably had the same experience. You can see this program on YouTube, and you can purchase it occasionally on eBay if you can find some old prints. It is not currently in release, but you can see it on YouTube. So back to our Gallup poll. 1949, 15% thought it was plausible. In 1955, 38% thought it was plausible. So why the change? Many people say that Collier series and the 3-part, well, it would be 2 parts of the Disney series that were broadcast in 1955 are the reason. There were other things happening there too. Quite a few children's programs on radio and television had space themes, but these are 2 that changed the discussion from being science fiction to being science factual. And that probably was more important in terms of changing public opinion about its possibilities. In 1960, the London Home Show got so excited about space that it employed Douglas Aerospace to design an exhibit of a full-scale space station. And it turned out to be very much like Skylab, that would be put into orbit some 15 or 13 years later. It had two large optical telescopes, a radio telescope, and also a return vessel and crew quarters, places where people, the astronauts maintaining all that equipment and operating it would live. Very much like Skylab. Now, this one I'm not even sure I should put in here. It's not just a space station. It is perhaps the first idea of a space colony or a space settlement. But it was presented by a Goodyear scientist as a part of a series. It would be modular in design, which would allow operations to begin immediately upon the first module being placed in orbit. This same concept was used in the development of the ISS. You know, it was assembled over many years, and this concept allowed the ISS to be useful right off the bat. This gives you an idea of the scale of what he was proposing, and this even more so. So perhaps a space settlement, if we ever accomplish true space settlements, this may very well be thought back on as an early concept. There was a film in 1957 done by the Soviets called Road to the Stars, and it featured large rockets taking materials to orbit, which were assembled into this space station. You can see this on YouTube, or if you want to purchase it, you can purchase it from Sinister Cinema. It is in Russian, but has English subtitles. And I'm going to just let you watch part of this because it is interesting. And it has been suggested that this really was providing ideas to Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke as they fleshed out the visual look for 2001, A Space Odyssey space station. And you'll see some similarities in it. I think it is interesting that long before the United States put women into space, they had the crew that looked like dominated by women doing technical aspects of the work, observing Earth all 24 hours a day and reporting meteorological phenomena back to the planet by way of radio. Now, this particular station was also home for many cosmonauts, and they are going to show you a little bit of, they had an iceberg service where they could track icebergs and report them. They couldn't destroy the icebergs, but they could track them. Communications and relay services, television, and comfy quarters with even a friendly cat to go home to each and every night. I throw this one in as well, Horizons at Disney World. I remember it so fondly, going to the space station, perhaps again so large that it really would be more like a space settlement, but a wonderful experience making use of the large Omnibax dome and three-dimensional materials in front of the dome as you went through. In 1958, Space Stations by Willy Ley, one of 4 books that he published, very colorful, very well thought out, and in this case, focusing on space stations. One of the things that he did in this publication was explain how a rotating station like this could be kept in balance. I hadn't thought of this prior to reading his book, but as people would move around on the station and equipment would be moved around, the wheel could very well get out of balance, just like your car wheel can get out of balance when it hits a rut. So he had a water balancing system which pumped water into different parts of the wheel in order to maintain a trim so that it would not wobble as it was rotating. He had an orbiting astronomical telescope separate from the space station so that it wouldn't be interfered with in terms of vibrations by the crew. And he had small craft which was used to go between the space station and the observatory. The wheel really became the primary concept for space stations for a long period of time, as you've seen, and it found its way into models and toys and science publications. It found its way into collector cards. And a lot of things that we adults now collect, but back then I think children are primarily the collectors. The space station metal toys from Japan, just beautifully done, all with that space wheel theme. Now this one was actually proposed by a company that said that instead of dropping off the external tank on the space shuttle, we should just take it with us on into orbit, clean it up, and create a space station. It never happened, but it was some pretty outside thinking based on real science. Frank Tinsley, an artist and science thinker, proposed moon farms. These would be orbiting space stations that would grow algae in collectors on the surface, with the sun providing the energy for the algae to grow. He also proposed a ball-shaped space station, and even showed how it might be constructed with the parts being carried up. So this again is another branch on that tree of space stations. Tom Swift and his outpost looks like it could be another branch. Very unusual design. Sky Masters, 1960-61. Sunday Comics had a wheel space station. And then the cinema. Spaceways featured a wheeled space station. Conquest of Space, likewise. A lot of the action took place on the wheel, as they called it. And of course, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Now these go beyond my 1960, but I wanted to share them with you at any rate. Moonraker, one of the Bond films, had perhaps the most audacious of the space stations. Definitely a major accomplishment if it was actually accomplished. And of course, then Bespin, the Cloud City of Star Wars. And Star Trek with the dry dock where the Enterprise was being refitted. So let's review the purposes of space stations. Refueling on the way to the moon or the planets, Mars or beyond. Transfer to spacecraft. Let's say you manage to make it off the Earth and to the space station, then you can select Mars, Moon, Venus, Saturn, wherever you might want to go. So it's a transfer point. Or it could be the point of launching a spacecraft that's actually put together at the space station, or it could be a place for repairing. And in today, it could be a place where astronauts are trying to deorbit debris clogging up our spaceways would reside. And tourism. Who wouldn't enjoy some zero-G gymnastics? Perhaps research labs for sure, hospitals perhaps. So that takes us up to 1960s and a little beyond. From 1960 until the International Space Station was actually committed to, NASA reviewed at least 100 different proposals from various various companies designed to entice and assist NASA in its design of a space station. And I'm going to end with some interesting little pictures of constructing a space station. I just love the artwork for its dimensionality. Even the black and white looks really cool to me. And of course, you can't have a space station if you can't assemble it. It is interesting to note that many people were concerned about our astronauts having to do so many EVAs to assemble the ISS. Turned out that we worked through that problem and it was quite successful, wasn't it? This is another Chesley Bonstell painting. So I think of this as the beginning of the story because we can go on into the actual accomplishments of space stations, the Soviets, the United States, and the international community. If you'd like to communicate with me, my email address is wcbrads@aristotle.net. My name is Bill Bradshaw, and that is what I have to share with you.
Thanks, Bill. That was really great. You know, the imagery, very fascinating. And you mentioned to me beforehand you were going to have it really beautifully illustrated with some of those images, and it really came to be. So love the presentation. What I want to do now is if you can stop sharing your screen real quick, and so we can get your we can get your image back up. There you go. Perfect. And want to just ask a few questions. A few things have come in, and also we had some questions that some of our members submitted when they registered. But I think the first one, speaking for all of us as collectors too, was will you be able to share your list of sources? Thanks for sharing 8 books, but you had some amazing sources there. And I think maybe there'd be something we could send out to all the attendees tonight, if you would be willing to do that for us, because that was one of the questions that came in too.
I'll see what I can do.
That would be great. I think a lot of us would appreciate that. And there's some really amazing books. Some of them, like you say, probably we couldn't get any more. You might have to pay your pretty penny on eBay or something like that. But they really looked pretty fascinating.
Actually, they're surprisingly inexpensive. They are basically children's books, but the artwork in them and the text is very sophisticated. So it's not unusual to find them anywhere from $5 to $25.
Oh. Okay, great. Well, we'll have to take a look. I think a number of us will be interested. You kind of touched on something in the presentation, and it was a question that came in about why you decided to choose 1960 as the endpoint, and you kind of went a little bit over because someone was asking, of course, about the iconic 2001 space station. Was there a reason you decided to cover just to 1960 and not go a little further?
Mainly your desire not to have the program extend beyond 50 minutes.
Okay. So arm constraint. Okay.
It was somewhat arbitrary. And there certainly is another whole program that could start at that point and go into the reality of the Soviet and American space stations.
Very good. So maybe we'll have you back for another round at some point as we look at it. One of the questions that came in were, and I think you've kind of covered it as well, but they wanted to know how realistic were the literary depictions of space stations relative to the actual science? And I could tell from some of the presentations you made, it was very good science involved in some of those concepts.
Yeah, I think overall, the authors provided us with a lot of very interesting ways of utilizing what a space station provided us. And the beginning point of anything is to think about what X, Y, or Z can actually accomplish. Now, some of them, like Tsiolkovsky and Nordung, were really based on scientific thinking, cutting edge in the case of Tsiolkovsky. So it was the beginning of thinking through, but even the science fiction authors like The Stone from the Moon, I really was fascinated with the idea that here the author was presenting something that we have to ponder today, and that is how do we create a space-based economy that can afford to do the things we want it to do in terms of going to the moon, going to Mars, and beyond.
Oh, very good, very good. Let me see about some of the other questions that came in prior. Someone had asked about, did any of the concepts take into account radiation protection?
No, I don't remember running into radiation during those periods of time as a concern. I think the Van Allen radiation belt wasn't discovered until Explorer 1 discovered it. So they were talking about doing experiments about cosmic radiation, solar radiation, but I don't think they had any concept, at least in what I've seen so far, that it was pervasive in the environment.
Very good. Someone had asked about the electrical power needs, and I know that you actually discussed some of those in some of the concepts, and it appears that even some of the illustrations, some of them did talk about how to power some of these space stations.
Yes, they all included a way, the large mirrors reflecting sunlight onto tubes, which would then produce steam, which would run a generator. What doesn't appear in any of them is solar collectors. They had solar reflectors, but the idea of solar cells was not presented in anything that I've seen. In the end, the Disney von Braun station used an atomic reactor to produce heat, which then produced steam, which then produced electricity. So those are the three general ways in which, prior to solar cells coming into such use, that they were thinking that electricity would be generated by for the space station.
I remember a special on TV about, was tongue-in-cheek in terms of the title, how William Shatner changed the world. And it talked about the case of how Star Trek, the technology portrayed in Star Trek, influenced engineers of today. And it goes to one of the questions that came in: how well do you think some of these concepts influenced the engineers of today to create what we currently have, or what maybe might be envisioning in terms of space stations?
Well, I think there are two ways in which they definitely influenced. One is the literature itself, and there's so many examples. For example, Robert Goddard, who I didn't mention in the program because he really didn't do much relative to space stations, but the great American rocketeer Robert Goddard was inspired in part by reading War of the Worlds. So the reading of science fiction seems to go along with rocketeers developing and continuing their interest in space. In terms of the actual technology, I guess I don't know. I guess I would leave it for you to decide how many of those that I shared with you contain at least elements of what's going on in the space station today. Some of the things were conceived, for example, Earth surveillance. For a long time, Earth surveillance has been done by weather satellites and all these other wonderful satellites. But in more recent years, they've given a camera to the astronauts on board the ISS and have encouraged them to take pictures of Earth. Now, how much use that's being made in terms of science, I don't know. But I think a lot of the things that were conceived for space station operations have been done, turned over to these robotic satellites because of telecommunications ability to transmit the images that they take.
Very good. Let me go to some of the questions that came in during the session. There was one from Larry, and I think it had to do with a concept you shared early on about why plates of sodium. Do you remember that one you shared?
Yes, I do. They just thought that it would hold up for whatever reason. The author said to himself and shared with us, the reader, that that the sodium would hold up better in the space environment than steel or aluminum. I don't know anything more than that, but it is odd. It is.
Nope, right. Very good. Another question from Bobby, but I think this one isn't really a space station question. In 1954, the first solar battery was created. Do you know what was the electrical supply source for the first space flight in 1961? And you know, I know the Mercury capsule had batteries. I don't know how, but I don't know if you're. We can certainly get that question answered from a bunch of experts we have.
Yeah, I think that in terms of manned spacecraft,
Yeah.
the Glenn's capsule, Shepard's capsule, I think you're right. It was just it was battery powered. I don't remember any solar cells, and there certainly wasn't any generator on board.
Yeah, and I'm sure probably the same for Yuri Gagarin's flight. I don't know.
Yeah,
so
right.
Yep. Another question was about the references, which hopefully we'll get a good list from you we can share. Bennett asked about the Men in Space series featured interior as well as exterior of the wheel in many episodes. Okay, just a comment there. So question from Donald, did you see the rendezvous in space at the Hall of Science Pavilion in the 1964-65 World's Fair? And if so, what did you think of it?
I did see it, and I thought it was really cool. The building itself was cool, the way it had a glass blocks built into the concrete structure of the building. But yes, the rendezvous, they had problems with it at first, but they did finally get it operating, and I did. It was really, really interesting.
Oh, great. Yep, that would have been nice to see. Let's see, another question from Matt. What is the status of using spinning space structures to get to Mars if the proposed mission time is 2.5 years?
Well, I think it's at the stage where space stations were in the 1960s, and that is people are throwing many, many different concepts. It's almost a cottage industry to propose going to Mars. And SpaceX is going to build a train to take us to Mars long before anybody's developed ways of keeping us alive once we get there. So Mr. Musk is going to provide us the transportation, but I don't know anybody who's working on the means of keeping the Mars astronauts alive once they arrive. In terms of whether artificial gravity would be necessary over 2.5 year period, we've had astronauts on board ISS for a year, and by having a regime of 2 hours of exercise every day, they seem to have overcome most of the problems associated with bone degradation and things like that, weightless conditions. Probably a bigger problem is the radiation that they're going to be exposed to. And we have to find ways of shielding them from that radiation on a long journey like that.
Very good. I know in the movie The Martian, of course, they did have a rotating spacecraft that took them to Mars for that reason. Another question from Matt: Were all the space station designs you studied based on 1G? Would seem that sub 1G might have been an option as well.
Well, several of the designs, for example, well, the one that was the springboard, it had labs on that 2.5 mile core, which were spaced different distances from the center point so that they could do experiments with different levels of artificial gravity. So that was an awareness of the opportunity to make use of zero G in research.
Very good. Question from David: most of these concepts involve construction in space. It doesn't seem like that has ever been attempted or even seriously investigated. Everything is 100% built on Earth and then linked together after launch, which is what Wernher von Braun was talking about. Do you think this is a practical limitation or a choice of technologies?
Well, I know there's a concept of using lunar material to build large space colonies or space settlements. That seems plausible, but not in the near term. So if we're going to do things in our lifetime, they're probably going to be limited to the materials that we can transport off of Earth. SpaceX and Blue Origin are developing reusable launchers, which could take 25 tons to Earth orbit each launch. So the possibility of taking large amounts of material to Earth, at least low Earth orbit, it seems very plausible in the near term, much more plausible than trying to get material off of the moon, process it into something useful, and then building with it.
Thanks, Bill. I think we're just about out of time for questions. So let me see if let me see if there's any other ones that have come in. And let's see. Did you look into the Bernal sphere concept in your presentation? That question from Jeff.
No, because I think of that as being the next step. Space stations are like, well, 7, 8 people in terms of reality of space stations, 50 in terms of von Braun space station, not tens of thousands of people. And that's what the Bernal sphere is leading towards. And not saying that it's not plausible, not saying that it won't be done sometime in the future, but it takes it to another whole level in terms of the complications of accomplishment.
And the last question I see from Grant: did the Mirror space station that used heat for thrust ever say what the rocket used for mass to heat and expel?
And say that again?
Yeah. Did the Mirror space station that used heat for thrust ever say what the rocket used for mass to heat and expel?
I think I probably didn't explain it well. It
No.
wasn't using heat for thrust. It was using heat for producing electricity. It was interesting. If you think back to Tsiolkovsky's Space Cottage, his thrust machine was simply shooting balls out of one side of the spacecraft. It was a reaction machine. It was like having a cannon on board. And when you wanted to go somewhere, you'd fire your cannon, the ball would go one direction and the space station would go the other. But I'm afraid I didn't explain myself well enough in terms of the thrust. It was not intended to be a thrust.
Very good. Thanks so much for the clarification, Bill. Well, again, it was just a fascinating, fun presentation, and we really appreciate taking the time to first to put it together and then to join us. And I think I'll speak for everybody. Probably we'd love to have you back a second time, and as we go forward with some more programming. So this is just the type of thing we're trying to mix up some history and some concepts with what's coming up next. And I think it's a great way to balance our presentations. So again, on behalf of all of us, we really appreciate taking the time and providing such a fun and informative presentation. So thank you so much, Bill.
Well, you're welcome, and I enjoyed doing it for you.
Very good. So let me just share my screen again, everybody, and I'll just briefly talk about where we're going with some of the upcoming presentations. And we do have a few guests on as well tonight to talk about what's coming up next. So the next town hall is going to be next week, and same time. And it's going to be a preview of the Virtual Space Settlement 2021, which is actually going to take place on February 4th, 2021. And that's from 9 to 4 Pacific time. And we have 3 of the people involved in putting this amazing session together, Aggie Coburn, Anita Gale, and Rod Pyle. And what I'd like to do is, I believe Aggie is on now too. There I see Aggie. And I could first turn it over to you, Aggie, to just tell us a little bit more about what's coming up and what we're going to be previewing next week, and hopefully get a really great crowd for the 4th.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bert. And this was really interesting. Thank you, Bill. It was a very enjoyable topic. We're planning a full day of almost like a recap of our Space Settlement Summit. Some of you, I looked through the list of people who were on this presentation, and some of you have been to the Space Settlement Summit in the past. In fact, one of our sponsors is on this call as well, I noticed. It is a 2-day summit that we do in the fall, typically in November, and it's really a deep dive into space settlement. And it's by invitation. It's a private event. Typically, we have under 100 people there. And this time we had to do it virtually. There was a small group in Las Vegas, but for the most part, it was virtual. And we recorded 2 days worth of wonderful information, panels, individual speakers, all sorts of things. So the talk on February 4th, the event will start with excerpts from that. Rod is doing an incredible job of editing. Thank you, Rod. Lots of editing to do. We're taking parts of the individual talks and parts of the panels and putting that together for everybody to attend. And by the way, we're looking at like maybe 40 or 50,000 people coming to that. It is a free event. We're going to promote it all over the world. And it's also in conjunction with space.com. That has a huge audience. So we're anticipating lots and lots and lots of viewers. And then Anita will tell you a little bit about what we'll be doing in the afternoon. So it's really exciting because the morning is Space Settlement Summit types of things, plus some add-ons, and Rod will tell you a few of those. We're adding on some information. The afternoon is all about the future, and it's the students, and it's, you know, where they're going and what we're doing there. So Rod, I'll let you take it from here. You're muted.
I'm not muted anymore. Hi, everybody. Bill, great presentation. Thank you. Bert, thank you for doing these. They're one of the highlights of the things that we offer now. So yeah, we're using a lot of content from the Space Settlement Summit, but we've also recorded a number of new pieces that we thought were important. So I did an interview with Pascal Lee, who many of you might know from the Mars Institute and his work with NASA Ames and SETI on the suitability of lava tubes for settlement. And he said some things that are kind of controversial, but it's a conversation. It's not a lecture. It's a conversation. So I think you'll enjoy that. We have a panel called Developments of 2020 for Cislunar Space, which is moderated by Bruce Pittman, and it's got Jeff Grayson and Pete Gerritsen and some other names you might all know. I'll just give you some of the highlights here. Another one called What are the Implications of a Race for Lunar Dominance, Cislunar Dominance, with Steve Quast, George Neld, and Peter Gerritsen again. What will be the role of science fiction in shaping the decade ahead? This one was really fun. We had Gregory Benford, David Brin, and Larry Niven, all science fiction authors that we know and love. And you get three guys like that in a room, and it's kind of an intellectual food fight. So that one's well worth seeing. Another one of these panels is just two people, myself and Tariq Malik, who's the managing editor at space.com, what's coming in new space. And Tariq is a fun guy. If you've never met him, he's just a wonderful person and has a lot to say, because I only have to do the magazine quarterly. He's got to do space news every day, so it's a big deal. Janet Ivey will be there. Isaac Arthur, who hosts his Science and Futurism podcast, will be there. Dr. Martine Rothblatt, who's a brilliant transhumanist who founded United Therapeutics Corporation, will be there. We've got a panel on new space and pandemics, focusing on COVID-19, it's not depressing, I promise. It's kind of fun. And then finally, we have a presentation by the winner of one of our design competitions named Sean Kinney, of a space settlement design that he made. And he is joined by Dr. Alan Stern, who he named his space station design after. And Stern, being the chief on the New Horizons mission, is a lot of fun. You can't do much better than that. I just wanted to add one small coda to the talk tonight, if you don't mind. It'll only take a second.
Sure, right.
If you go on YouTube and look up those old Disney videos, there's two Man on the Moon videos. One's animated and it's fun to watch because it's Disney. The other one's live action, and it's got all these, lantern-jawed tough guys in their rocket headed off the moon. Lots of cool technology that didn't happen. But when they do it just a single orbit of the moon, it's the same footage you saw if you years back went to the flight to the moon at Disneyland. And when they're going around the moon, they're talking to mission control, even though they're on the far side of the moon, and they fire flares down on the surface to see things. So you see a crater, and then there's another flare and another crater. And then the third or fourth flare, I think it's a fourth flare they send down, you see this rectangular wall down there that's obviously some artifact from an alien civilization. And they cut back to the rocket men, and they kind of look at each other and nod in a very manly way. And they don't say anything to mission control. They just fly home. And I thought, that is so Walt Disney, It's very cool. So if you get a chance, I highly recommend them. They're a lot of fun. And thanks for Bill for bringing them up. And that's all I got. Thank you.
Thanks, Rod. Anita, anything additional to add?
Well, yes. So Rod mentioned that there will be a presentation of the winning design for the Space Settlement Contest, which has been going on by NSS. Used to be also co-sponsored by NASA Ames since the 1990s. Since the 1980s, I have been involved with the Space Settlement Design Competition, which was independent of NSS until just a few years ago. And we have linked up with the National Space Society, so NSS is a co-sponsor of the Space Settlement Design Competition. This is a competition that has live weekend semifinals literally all around the world. We have students in India and communist China, and I was just introducing the Australian semifinal is starting tomorrow in Australia. Did that this afternoon. UK 4 semifinals in the United States. We have some footage in the event on the 4th of February about the Space Settlement Design Competition. We'll have some description of what it is and some of the history of it. The Space Settlement Design Competition is very different than the contest. The contest is basically y'all design whatever you want about space or space settlements. The Space Settlement Design Competition is an industry simulation exercise. We actually put students into the position of being on an industry proposal team. We have a customer that's defined. We defined a future year. We give them a request for proposal, just like in industry, with a customer specifying requirements for a particular space settlement in a particular location for a particular economic purpose. We actually will have the finalist presentation, the winning finalist presentation from last year's finals at Kennedy Space Center in July. And Rod is going to be editing that, and he'll have some captions that will indicate, thank you, will indicate what elements of that design were actually required by the request for proposal. Also, we define subcontractors, so you might see kind of a strange name, and Rod will add captions that will indicate, well, that's part of the program book that was defined for the students. And then also we find from this that we end up being an amazing, I don't want to sound self-complimentary, but students tell us that literally, and alumni tell us literally their lives are changed by participating in this weekend. And we will have testimonials from some of the students and the alumni about their experiences with the design competition. And literally, we have alumni of the competition who have gone on to work in the space industry. Some are working in other areas of engineering and STEM. And it's really very inspiring stuff. So teachers would be interested in this. Students who may be interested in participating, it's for high school, would be interested in this part of the program on 4th of February.
Very good. Thank you so much, Anita. I think, Rod, you had one more thing to add?
Yeah, I just want to add one more thing. Anita's being very modest. I've got this footage clogging up my hard drive as we speak, and I've been going through it. And I can't tell you how much I wish I was 18 or 20 right now, because I would be all over that competition. It's hard work. It's a number of days. They work themselves into a froth to get it done. But I've seen the interviews from these young finalists, and they are just in the clouds over this. They are so thrilled that they got to participate. I mean, how much better is it to be able, what's better than being able to do that at the Kennedy Space Center? I mean, can you imagine when we were kids, we got to see Walter Cronkite. Well, when I was a kid, got to see Walter Cronkite talking about Apollo, and that was great enough. But to be able to participate in a meaningful way with a bunch of industry professionals, and Jeff Knott can also attend the last one. And while they were going through the technical stuff, he was helping with presentation and performance, which is something he knows quite well. So it's the whole package. So I think especially for younger people, but also, as Anita said, for teachers and educators, this is a really wonderful opportunity to get a periscope into what she's been doing and some of the opportunities out there for people headed into STEM fields.
Very good. Oh, go ahead, Aggie.
One last word. We will tell you all about it next week, so please join us for that. And again, thank you, Anita, for being a wonderful sponsor of the event, and Heinlein Price Trust, because those were our two main sponsors for that particular event. And Edwin Jones, who's on this call, was a major sponsor for the Space Settlement Summit, so thank you to you as well, because we couldn't do these things without our sponsors. And thank you, Bert, for everything that you do and making all these presentations available to everybody, and Larry and everybody else that's involved in all of this, Jim and Fred, and making these weekly presentations, because they're wonderful for the NSS.
Oh,
and the members that pay our bills.
Thank you all so much. We really look forward to next week's presentation, and ultimately the settlement summit on the 4th. And also, Rod, there was a comment in the chat about the great articles in the latest issue of Ad Astra, so I just wanted to point that out. Okay.
Thank you. There was also a question about. There was also a question about doing artificial gravity with tethered modules, and as it turns out, we have a feature article in the upcoming issue, which is the 100-page space settlement issue. So it's something near and dear to all of us. That's about that exact subject. So timely question, and thank you.
Very good. So thanks again, everybody. Let me just close out then. I know we're running a little bit later, and we do have another session coming up the week after, and we'll be getting the announcement out for all of these shortly. So everyone should be looking in their email. But the Space Forum on the 28th will be Ask an Astronaut, a conversation with astronaut Terry Virts. So that should be really interesting. There's going to be an introduction by board member Greg Autry, and Jeffrey List, another board member, is going to moderate it. Jeffrey's moderated a couple of these events for us previously. So make sure you watch for your emails. It was also announced in Downlink. And we look forward to some great sessions coming up through the rest of the year as well. So I close with, again, make sure you check out our NSS website, space.nss.org. And there's also a little blurb in the Downlink newsletter that you probably got yesterday about signing into our member portal. inside.nss.org. It is for members only, but it gives you tremendous access to a lot of resources that can enhance your membership experience. And finally, encourage all of you to help support NSS, not only with your memberships, but if you can make a donation, we'd certainly appreciate it. So all those things would help us out. So we thank you again for tonight. I do want to thank Fred Becker, who as always provides great technical support to us. We couldn't do these without him. And so on behalf of Larry Ahern and myself, just thank you again for attending. Have a great evening for those of you in these time zones. I know a number of people join us from other time zones, so it's probably maybe the start of the day. And also have a great weekend coming up. And I just wish you all to, staying safe and being healthy, and we'll see you next week. So thank you, everybody.